Well, welcome in, LSU fans, the Go 24/7 podcast. My name is Bryce Koon alongside Glen West. And Glen, as we record this today, I believe March 5th, yeah, I think we're exactly 1 week away from our first media availability for spring football. The Tigers will take the field this weekend to kick off spring practice. And Glenn, you kind of alluded to it. We've kind of gotten through this weird, awkward period. After bowl season, the portal slows down. Recruiting's not necessarily a hot topic, but baseball is. But we get into more content purposes for football, and we're going to talk about that today as well. But I'll kind of kick it off, man. How was Mardi Gras for you? And did you enjoy it? Did you partake? I know you joked with me earlier. There was kind of those things like once you've done it, you've done it, and you're good to go.
Yeah, I grew up in New Orleans, so I went to every year for 25 years to Mardi Gras, and so was able to hit up Endymion on Saturday. I believe Endymion's on Saturday. I get my days jumbled up on Mardi Gras weekend. It's just a lot of stuff going on. So, but yeah, we hit up Endymion, and then was able to kind of just kick back and relax, watch some baseball from this past weekend. The baseball team obviously did extremely well, and had a close call last night against North Dakota State, and we got another one coming here on Wednesday. I think by most time people are watching this, they'll know the result of that one as well. So, but yeah, no, everything was good, and very excited to get back into the swing of things for football and get this 2025 season off the ground, because this really is kind of the first introductory that we're going to get to this team here over the next several weeks, and I'm excited to see how they integrate all these new players and all these new pieces on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, I think that's something I'm really, as we kind of enter in here, just things we want to see, Glenn, and we can kick it off with this, just the new players, because I think in this day and age of football, like, you go back 5 years ago, yeah, you knew some of the freshmen, but how many of those guys would really be contributors now with the portal? And, obviously as aggressive as LSU was in the portal, I think there's a lot of storylines just with the newcomers, there. So I wanted to start out, who's maybe a newcomer, maybe on both sides of the ball, or just one in general that you're like, hey, I can't wait to watch what this guy looks like in a purple practice jersey as these guys get ready, to ramp up for the spring.
Yeah, I think for me offensively, I got to start with Nick Anderson. I mean, I've been pounding the drum on that guy ever since he committed and they signed him, and I just think he's going to be a huge, huge weapon for Garrett Nussmeier in the passing game, and I think he's poised for a really big time season. And he's a guy that we didn't get to see a whole lot of last year. He was banged up for most of the season in Oklahoma. Obviously, we know the struggles they went through as a passing offense when he went down. So I'm very curious to see what version of we get of him. I think he's just kind of that prototypical X factor kind of numero uno kind of guy. Like I think they're going to lean on him heavily, really from the jump here. And really this spring is going to be very interesting because they have a lot of returning pieces in that wide receiver room. Really, Nick Anderson and Barian Brown are the two newcomers that they're going to have to kind of get up to speed with the offense. And I'm curious to see how they ease those guys in, because last year, if you'll remember, there were a couple new pieces on offense and they didn't exactly jump out in the spring. Like I don't think
be real. CJ Daniels didn't really pop off.
CJ Daniels wasn't. I mean, he was running with the twos. Xavier Thomas was running with the twos for the most part in spring. And I think most of that had to do with the fact they were just getting those guys up to speed with the offense. And I'll be curious to see if that's the same case with a guy like Anderson and Brown. I would think maybe they start the spring kind of rotating in and out, but they've got to get reps with Nussmeier on the field, in pads, in front of the coaching staff. Yeah. And I think that's one for me offensively that I'm just endlessly curious to see how they utilize, because I think he's somebody that has enough athleticism to where you can move him all across the field. You can split him out at the X. You can put him down in the slot. Certainly in red zone packages, I think there's different ways to get him involved in the passing game. So this is kind of the big swing that LSU took in the offseason, was at that receiver room, and one of the big spots where I think they brought in some game-changing talent. So I'll start with Anderson on offense. Defensively, I think there's really only one spot you can go to, and for me, it's corner and Mansur Delane. Like I think there's having that bona fide experienced cornerback that has done it and has a lot of experience and has production at a high level is just an invaluable tool for this defense as you try to rebuild this secondary and get it to where it needs to be for 2025 in order for this defense to have a lot of success. And part of what they're going to do with Delane, I would imagine, is they'll have him at corner. I wouldn't be surprised if we walk out there one day, though, and he's out at safety and he's getting some reps in the deep part of the field because – I think you kind of have this vision that Tamarcus Cooley's going to be your nickel. He's going to be somebody that's up close to the line of scrimmage. And outside of that, they did not really attack the safety position in the transfer portal. And if there's a couple guys that maybe can stand out at corner, like a DJ Pickett or a Jakeem Jackson, I think that they can be a little bit more flexible with what they want to do with a guy like Delane. So, that to me is going to be one of the questions that I have, and is something that I mentioned in our piece here previewing the spring. I broke down one question from every position room, and at corner, it was kind of how they integrate Mansour Delane at both spots, because I think he's somebody that they can move around and be flexible with this spring.
Yes, I'm going to cheat with you, and I'm going to go back to the offensive side of the ball and tell you that I was going to pick Nick Anderson, but I do have a second option. You took both my first options, but it's just great minds think alike. Yeah. No, but seriously, going to the offensive side of the football, I was tempted to go, with Barian Brown, because I just think that he is explosive. And when not getting too far ahead into depth charts and stuff like that, but if you just kind of go based off the logic of a starting receiving core of Anderson with what he did his freshman year, if he can capture that, Barian Brown and his production alongside Aaron Anderson, buddy, there's some explosive playmaking opportunities to really be had. But I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at the offensive line, which I think is an intriguing position battles there, and maybe one that is not going to be left up to a lot of questions, is the center position, because you went and got Braylon Moore. And I'm just excited to see kind of what he brings in terms of his command, in terms of him being able to call out different things as a veteran guy. And, we'll talk about this, but obviously DJ Chester was left a little bit to be desired at the center position last year. Now he's got a battle for a spot. We expect to be at the guard spot. But I think one of the things with Moore is that it provides, however long Moore stays in the program, a veteran presence for Chester to continue to work off of. Obviously, he had that 2 years ago, his freshman year, but now Chester entering his third year, we saw that maybe he quite wasn't ready for not just the playing the position, maybe the responsibility that it took being the center and making call outs and making reads and stuff like that. So Braylon Moore is a guy that I'm going to watch, obviously Josh Thompson as well, but Moore is the guy that I really want to look at and see how he handles himself and the way he looks and commands that offense. The defensive player that I like here, and it was my second option, and I think it's more because when you look at where LSU struggled so much, yes, Glenn, the back end of the secondary, the back end of the defense of the secondary spot has been needing to be better. But LSU really struggled in SEC play giving up the run. And a guy who immediately inserts, in my opinion, along the front seven is a guy like Jack Pyburn, who is really good. Maybe he doesn't have the sack numbers that people want to see, but in terms of run defense and tackles for loss, this is a guy who grades out really well per PFF. When you watch the film, that kind of backs PFF as well, just what he's able to do, setting the edge. I mean, Glenn, you go back and look at what they struggled last year. Marcel Reed, Jalen Milroe. It wasn't just, runs of 5, 6, 7. It was big gashing plays. And so just having a front seven that can help with that. I still got some questions about the interior defensive line. Obviously, who's going to coach, that group in the fall as well. But in terms of what I like to see, it's Pyburn's ability to help in the run game, but also a little bit of the mentality, right? And everything we've kind of heard about Pyburn and talking with some people who covered him at Florida was, look, he is high energy. He is very confident, and he has a little bit of swagger. And that's kind of what I think LSU fans want to see this defense get back to, a confident swagger that really entails what the Tigers defense was known for most of the 2010s. And even before that, just a group that they know they play well and they back it up with their play. So I'm interested to see what Pyburn brings in the competitive fire that he shows out there as well in terms of the newcomers, because I think that, you could go with Pyburn there. You could go with Patrick Payton as a pass rusher. Jamari Butler, who, in his sample size had some good things that he did at Nebraska as well. But I'm really, I can't ignore when you give up 200 plus yards in your losses in SEC play on the ground, and that's a big issue. And I feel like Pyburn, when you don't have it in the interior necessarily, we think you've got a guy who's done it at Florida and helped in the run game. So I'm going with Pyburn in that category there.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Hyburn because it wasn't just the inside run that was getting LSU killed last year.
Outside,
It
yeah.
was the improvisation on the outside with these quarterbacks, and you'd hope that a guy like Pyburn and Peyton and Harold Perkins, when he gets healthy, like those guys can help kind of create a front line of defense there for those mobile quarterbacks because they're facing all these guys again. I mean, they're going to
Yeah.
play Marcel Reed, they're going to play Lenora Sellers, they're going to play a pretty mobile quarterback in Clay Klubnik on week 1 against Clemson. So I like that pick a lot. To your point about Braylon Moore, like I think he's just going to bring a veteran presence to this group
Yeah.
that they desperately need because they're going to be going through some pretty hefty transition at the other spots, and I think we can maybe stick with offensive line here because I think
Yeah.
from a position standpoint, that to me is going to be like the group to focus in on because there's just so much unsettled with that offensive line. I mean, you talk about DJ Chester. This was a guy who started every game last year. He doesn't have a guaranteed spot on this
Yeah.
offensive line right now, at least the way I read it. I think there's going to be some crazy competition there, whether it's Josh Thompson at guard when he gets in. Sonny reported a couple weeks ago that he's supposed to be getting in after the first week or so of spring practice. So what he can do at one of those guard spots, you and I have talked both on air and off air about a guy like Carius Kern and just kind of the versatility that he has in his game. He's already like 6'4", 6'5", 330 pounds. Like that dude can go in.
He's repping 225 30 times. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like he can absolutely from a physical perspective be thrown right into that mix. I mean, Paul Mubanga is a guy who got a lot of snaps last year on the interior.
Yeah.
You can never count out a veteran like Bo Bordelon and his continued development, and then at the tackle spots, like there's a lot of guys in the mix there too, whether it's Tyree Adams at left tackle or Weston Davis on the right side. I mean, there's a lot of guys here that have an opportunity, I think, to kind of secure a spot, but nothing's guaranteed right now. And I think going into spring, how those guys perform, what Brad Davis is looking for out of that group, how that group can kind of gel together early here in spring, and what that does for the offense. Like, do we start to see some glimpses of an offense that can run the ball more effectively on the perimeter? Do we start to see some pass protection for Garrett Nussmeier? I mean, I know nobody's going to get close to Garrett Nussmeier in the spring. Like that's going to be a given, but
Throw the red jersey on. Yeah.
but just are the defensive players, are these veteran pass rushers that you've brought in from SEC programs and the Florida States of the world, are they going to be able to break the offensive line down? Like I think those guys are going to have a distinct advantage because they're just taught, see ball, get ball. Offensive line, when you talked with Will Campbell last year, you give up a sack a game, you're at the bottom of the league. Like you're not an actual draft prospect or an actual college football offensive lineman if you're giving up those kinds of plays game in, game out. So
Yeah.
the spring to me is going to be very important for the offensive line, I think, from a group perspective and just kind of the chemistry and how those guys really work together to make this a more efficient and prolific offense, because I think we all are in agreement that this team's going to go as far as Garrett Nussmeier can take them in terms of the passing game, and having a good complement of running plays, of protection for Nussmeier, of having those offensive linemen continue to pull and grow in that development to expand the running game, having Nussmeier more willing to escape the pocket on his own and kind of dart upfield for a couple of yards here and there. All these things are going to be really explored here in the spring. This is a time where you can kind of test different things out, test different scenarios, test different lineup combinations and things of that nature. And so I'm going to be very curious how the offensive line comes together. That, to me, if we're talking about a specific position group that has the most questions going into the year or going into the spring, I would say offensive line is right up there at the top for me.
Yeah, and I think it's different, right? Because when you look at other position groups, and I'll kind of get to mine, and that was kind of the next topic to segue in, is it's not because it's devoid of talent. Like Brad Davis has recruited at a very high level, and at some point, some of these guys are going to have to play, right, over the past 2 cycles. Well, now you're seeing, the fruits of the labor of what you've done in the recruiting field now into the playing field. Like, can these guys matriculate and can they make that jump? And I like what you said there too, because I think that You can get creative with it. Look, I mean, everything that we've heard outside of the football ops buildings that Carius Kern is a dude. Now, look, if that message that they're pushing is true, then we might see him, be mauling some guys over and stuff like that. And I was talking with someone earlier too, Glenn, just about the need to get better in the interior of the offensive line, because that's like the big question. Obviously, you're bringing in Josh Thompson. You hope that he is, good to go at one of the guard spots. You bring in Braylon Moore. If you can solidify that other guard spot, if it's Kern, if it's Chester, if it's, anybody, Mabinga, if it's Cohen Eccles, whoever this is, you really start to feel better about the development of your running game, because you have talent back there. But in terms of being able to get push up front, especially in the middle, I think that's something that is really interesting to watch. And so I like what you said. Offensive line going to be something that we're going to pay a lot of attention to. Who's the first team, who's the second team. That'll be really, I think, all eyes, binoculars from up top in the building. We'll all be looking down at that as well to see how that works, especially against the defensive line. I wanted to make I wanted to make this claim, because I think this is something also that's really interesting to watch as well, and just from my perspective, and get your thoughts on it. You talked about the defensive line and some of these edges working against a Tyree Adams on the outside, so you really get to see, when you're put under pressure, what does that look like? In terms of one-on-one battles, it's been so long since LSU has had guys in the secondary that can lock something down. I don't know if they have that this year. I think you have guys that could grow into it, but I don't think coming into the spring anyone's like, yeah, that guy's a lockdown, shutdown player. But I'm excited to watch what I think is a talented group of receivers work against a secondary that probably has still a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, wanting to prove that they're better. Corey Raymond is getting more of guys that fit his mold in terms of what they want in that room, and continue to do that. So look, all eyes are going to be on when DJ Pickett lines up in a one-on-one against somebody. Jakeem Jackson is another guy that I think is very interesting. Has the raw talent and the ability. How does that translate now that he's at his second school? And then you mentioned Mansour Delane. I mean, look, I'm going to be real with you, Glenn. I covered the ACC for a long time, quality competition. This is going to be a step up. Different guys, different types of dudes. So, I think in terms of one-on-one battles, and then just the growth and development of how these guys look comfortable on the back end, is something I'm going to be watching in the secondary. And I wanted to throw one more name in there, because I think that this is applicable, because Sonny has pounded his fist about this over and over, and I think it's worth mentioning. Deshaun Spears. Is that a guy who really makes a jump? Like you mentioned, they didn't go heavy in the portal at safety really at all, outside of Cooley, and you could cross-train Delane. But I think it shows that they have faith. And you said this multiple times. They've got faith in those young guys. And look, Spears was thrown into the fire last year. He had to learn on the go. That's tough for anybody. Not everyone's Derek Stingley to a certain extent, where they just learn as a freshman and they ball out. But I think that just watching how those first-year guys have developed, and then just watching, the battles, because I'm not saying LSU has a guy, Glenn, that can just go out there and, if you're an old, I don't even want to say old school NFL fan, because it makes me feel old, the old Revis Island or something like that. But if you've got guys that can lock down a portion of the field, are we going to be able to see any of that? Like, is that something that we noticed early on? Like, hey, these are good receivers these guys are going up against, and they're holding their own. That's something we could see. And I'm just intrigued to watch those battles and see how far along this secondary really is.
Yeah, I mean, the few times we got to watch kind of a full practice last year during spring, the one-on-one battles I thought were a stark difference than the year before. Like, I think I remember us saying this at the time, like, the corners were actually holding their own a couple times in those one-on-one battles with those receivers last year in spring ball, and it gave us a little bit more confidence. And I think when we got to the actual games, we saw that there was just maybe a little bit of it wasn't there. It wasn't Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas, going up against whoever on the other side from that defense prior. So I think we had maybe a shaded view of what that actually looked like last spring. I don't think we have that case this year. I think there's talent on both sides of offense and defense in terms of the secondary and the receivers that they're going to be going up against. And I mean, I know that if we do get a chance to watch one-on-ones, I'll be endlessly curious to see if the guy like DJ Pickett at 6'4" goes up against a 6'4" Nick Anderson in a one-on-one battle. Like I
Yeah.
think that would be a lot of fun to watch and see if the freshman can hold his own. And I think for me, it's a matter of when, not if. Pickett gets
Yeah.
into that starting rotation for LSU this year. Like, does it happen in the spring? Does it happen later in fall camp this year? Does he make a big push during summer with workouts and just kind of how the coaching staff is looking at him from afar? But I think that there's going to be a lot more. There's going to be a lot stiffer competition this spring than maybe there have been in a couple of years past, and I think it's because there's talent on both sides of the offense and defensive part of the secondary and the receivers and the names that they're going to be throwing to. So that's not saying that it's going to be smooth sailing for either side. Like, I think there's going to be some growing pains with Nussmeier in terms of, finding the timing, locking down the timing with some of those newcomers, just as much as I think it's going to be a bit of an adjustment for this new secondary to kind of gel and communicate in the right way on one-on-ones or on 7-on-7 drills, where it's just receivers, it's your athletes against our athletes kind of thing on those 7-on-7 drills. So, that to me is going to be interesting to watch as well. And, I keep coming back to the point here that if LSU, they did not go into the portal and make a huge difference at safety this winter cycle. And, I think with Cooley, you're hoping that he can be that nickel for you up front. But I don't know that I think one of the more intriguing thoughts here is what happens if both Pickett and or Jakeem Jackson / Ashton Stamps / PJ Woodland. What if one of those three, like two of those four, are like in the spring, they're locking guys down, they're doing their jobs on the outside? Does that allow LSU some flexibility to put Mansur Delane back there at safety? Is that something that he wants to do? I mean, I think part of the recruiting pitch from LSU is that, hey, you can come in here and play corner if you want, but we're also going to test you out some at safety. Like, I think that's a legit possibility. So to me, like, I think there's going to be a lot of interesting conversations around that as we go through spring camp and just kind of what that looks like, what the rotations are like at safety. I mean, we haven't even talked about Jordan Gilbert or Javian Toviano. You mentioned Deshaun Spears a little bit there, but they really need to improve the tackling in that safety room, because they're the last line of defense. And last year, when the linebackers and the defensive line wasn't making the plays up front, the safeties had to be there, and they just weren't always taking the right angles. They weren't always making the right tackles and right reads on some of those longer explosive plays, and it cost LSU big time in some of those games. They didn't all go for touchdowns, but they were enough to flip the field and kind of put the defense back on their heels a little bit in some of those games. So it's going to be really important for that safety group, I think, to continue to develop, and it's going to be a big offseason for a lot of those guys in the secondary.
Yeah, it was reported, I guess, last week, obviously, and we obviously expected this as well, that both Harold Perkins and Whit Weeks will not participate in spring practice. And so it also offers a glimpse, Glenn, into kind of what the defense looks like without those guys. Not that you hope you have those two guys in the fall and you want to play with them, but just in terms of the linebacking core, I think it provides some other opportunities for like a guy like Devon Keys. Is that a guy that can continue to progress off in freshman season that I thought was pretty solid for the case that he was brought into, and obviously ended that bowl game with the pick six in the Texas Bowl. You have West Weeks, which, look, I think a lot of people we like to talk about Whit Weeks. He's kind of like Paul Bunyan in the Blue Ox. He's just like a folk hero around LSU a little bit. But in terms of West Weeks, it's like, okay, we've talked about you a lot. There was a very obvious plan with talking with West at the end of the season and talking with people close to him of, you're going to redshirt because you're not 110% healthy, so you can play next year. And obviously the cool story on the field is you get to play next to your brother. But in terms of who is Westweek as a player, Glenn, I still think that if you're real with yourself, we don't really know like what he looks like over the course of a large data sample at LSU at the linebacker spot. I mean, he's been a reserve, been a special teams guy, has played, has great athleticism. But I think that this spring also offers an opportunity at the linebacking core to really know, hey, you didn't go in the portal and get anybody. So pretty much what you're saying is we feel like we're good here. Witt's not going to be available, so it's going to be West and Keys. And then just these host of guys that are, I will say, Blake Baker's dudes that he really likes that could play the position of where you get to see a lot of young guys that I'm not saying they're going to start against Clemson in August or anything like that, but could prove their worth and say, hey, maybe we find ourselves like Keys was in that same spot come this fall.
Yeah, I mean, look, Tylen Singleton, Charles Ross. When you get here in the summer, Keelan Moses is going to be thrown into that mix as well. I think they like the depth they have at that spot, and this is going to be the perfect 4 or 5 week session here to see really what they have from a depth perspective. Because I mean, a lot of these guys, particularly the ones that are available here in the spring, they're not new. Like, I mean, they've been here, they've been around the program, they've been around this defense now for over a year with Blake Baker. So how Wes Weeks performs, how Devon Keys performs, how they go about structuring this defense, knowing that they're going to have Harold Perkins and Whit Weeks to bring back here in the summer, is going to be very interesting to me, because I think there's a understanding here that Harold's going to be in the start when he returns and when he's fully healthy. But in the meantime, you've got to have somebody to fill that spot. And right now we think it's going to be Tamarcus Cooley in that nickel role. Like, they're going to probably have a little bit of a different structure, right, in terms of who's going to be that guy, that off-ball guy that's going to be in the slot. And, it's not going to be Perkins. It's going to be Cooley. And how does that, kind of change over the course of the off season? Like, how many 3 linebacker sets do they flirt with this spring? Like, I mean, having Wes Weeks, Devon Keys, and then maybe Singleton all out there at the same time. Because I think when LSU they did this a little bit last year, where they had those 3 linebackers on the field towards the end of the season. It was the Weeks brothers, and then it was Keys, who also played a little bit of a linebacker role for them. How much do they explore with that, and like how they set up the middle part of their defense, I think is going to be very interesting to watch unfold, knowing the guys that you don't have right now and who are going to be obviously huge parts of this thing if you want to see the kind of progress you want on that side of the ball.
Yeah, if you want to see the progress, then you would love to see some of these guys. And obviously, I think you mentioned this the other day. Just spring's huge, but then in the summer, like when you don't have the coach's eyes on you all the time, and you're working on things both in the weight room to get ready for all that kind of stuff. I think the linebacker room's kind of intriguing because we haven't talked about it a lot. It's one of those things where you just say, yeah, you got the Weeks brothers, you got Devon Keys, but also there's a lot of young, intriguing names.
It's one of the few positions on the roster. You know what you have.
Yeah, you know what you have, and for better or worse, time will tell. You didn't go after the portal. They obviously showed a vote of confidence in the guys in that room. They say, we think that, even the young guys, if needed, can step up there. And I think that also speaks to the testament of Blake Baker as a coach and getting guys ready. And you saw that last year with Devon Keys. Glenn, let's talk about this real quick, because we can hit on this. Look, we can end it with this too. We've talked, obviously, everyone knows. We talked about this last week. The defensive line, there's no reason to continue to rehash that. We know the names. You know who's there. You got to get better. You got to find a coach, all that stuff. But we're going back to the offensive side of the football. I think one of the things that I'm going to be looking at and going to be watching is what type of jump can Garrett Nussmeier make? I believe that Garrett Nussmeier, and this is not just because I'm on an LSU podcast or on the LSU beat, I think Garrett Nussmeier is pound for pound the best pure passer in the SEC in 2025. Like, when you just look at what he has. Glenn, I don't know if there's really a better passer, and we'll have to see what Arch Manning is in terms of when he gets in a rhythm, and we saw it at times last drive against Ole Miss and, different spurts, South Carolina for a little bit, and when he didn't throw the interceptions. When he's in rhythm, he is really good, like very, very good, elite. And there's a lot of belief that he could be one of the first quarterbacks taken, in 2026 when that draft comes. But I wanted to ask you this. If there's one thing, I've got the thing in my mind, if there's one thing you want to see him develop that, you leave spring saying, okay, he's a different version. What does that one thing have to be for you to give that vote of confidence of maybe saying, hey, I expect him to have a great season, and maybe even expect him to be a Heisman finalist type of player?
Yeah, I think for me, like a lot of what you kind of hope to see from him in terms of development, we're not going to learn until we actually get into like the game mode, until we get to the games. But I think one thing that you can learn in spring camp and in fall practice and in the summer, and how he's going about working, how much has the game slowed down for him over the last 4 or 5 months? Like, how much
Yeah.
has he been able to kind of watch film from last year, learn different things about himself and about how he can be most effective in the SEC next year? Like, I think we started to see it a little bit towards the end of the season in those final couple games, but there were times there, especially in the middle of SEC play, when LSU was going through their struggles with those 3 straight losses, that um, the game was a little sped up for him. Especially, you can look in that second half against A&M. The rails, it kind of got off the rails for him. Certainly, the Alabama game, the offense was not very effective at all. Lots
Florida
of
game.
three and
Yeah.
outs, lots of missed passes, and then I think that the game was a little fast for him at times when it got really tight. And I think going through that experience and going through all of that, to me, uh, you know, how he comes out of that on, I think we can start to see a little bit in the spring. Like, how in command is he of this offense, in terms of ball placement, in terms of getting guys lined up, and knowing what he wants out of each individual. Like, I think those are all things that you can learn a little bit in the spring about how this offense is operating. So for me, how he slows down, how he slows the game down. I mean, you're not going to see a whole ton of 11 on 11. I don't think this spring we're going to see a lot of 7 on 7, a lot of 1 on 1, maybe some 11 on 11 stuff at the very end as they try to implement some of what they want to do offensively and defensively. But
Yeah.
I think for me, how he commands the offense and how much the game slows down for him, I think should be something we can see at least a little bit here in the spring.
And maybe this is kind of falling in line with what you're saying here, but the one word that Brian Kelly continued to use about Jaden Daniels in year 1 to year 2 was decisiveness. And I think that when you saw Nussmeier, and in large part that has to do with how the game's slowing down around him, like you mentioned. But when you saw Nussmeier be decisive, what did you see? You saw the throw over the middle to win the game, or to tie the game, to send it to overtime against Ole Miss. Like, you saw the anticipation that he has and be able to do that. That
Fourth
for
quarter drives
me.
against South Carolina was another great
Exactly.
example.
Yeah, you have multiple instances, moments where when he locks in, like I said earlier, he's elite. Like, he has that. And look, you can't ignore the stats. 4,000 yards passing. Like, it is what it is. But I was kind of going back at this, Glenn. You mentioned the game slowing down in a span of 5 games, okay, starting from the South Alabama game on September 28th and then going all the way to the Alabama game. He threw 9 interceptions in that, and that was really, you count, go back and look at the schedule. That's 2 big losses. I mean, you weren't out of it when you went to Florida, but we all knew, like, it was going to take, you needed to beat Florida and you needed some help. Like, you needed some help to get to Atlanta and make a playoff. That being said, though, I think that decisiveness and slowing the game down kind of goes into my take, is like, if you cut down the turnovers, and I don't think this is a crazy take, but if you can cut down on the turnovers, buddy, you've got a guy that could be in New York, because he has everything else, the arm talent. He's got the ability, and like you alluded at the beginning of the podcast, we believe he has the weapons around him with the running backs and the receiving core that you brought in. Like, if the offensive line is good, like, everything is there in terms of the recipe. And Glenn, I don't know how you are as a cook, but oftentimes if you don't follow that recipe, or the recipe doesn't work out, food's not very good. Now, you're from Louisiana, food's always good. But you know what I'm saying? Like, it's one of those things where he's got it all around him. You cut down the turnovers. I like that. And so, in terms of what we can see, I think in those 7-on-7, just an ability to anticipate and an ability to, you know, pre-snap. I've got a pretty good idea of where I'm going with the football, and it's going to take a great play from the defense to stop me.
Yeah.
I feel like, and look, I know he had Malik Neighbors and Brian Thompson. Looking back on that, they just beat the brakes off of that group in fall camp and spring practice and stuff like that. But I do truly believe that you can take away some things. And like you said, if you feel like the game's slowing down and he's being decisive and he's making great throws and putting it where his guys need to be, like, that's a good sign. Now, with the pass rush, there's a whole different thing. But in terms of the 7-on-7, I like that as well. But I think it's an exciting time, man. I think it's good. The running backs, you look at that, you could dive into all the different types of things of, what is Caleb Jackson's role? JT Lindsey not on campus yet, so this is a massive spring for Jackson to kind of show his worth. there as well. And, also see some new coaches, right? Like you get to see how does Alex Atkins work with a guy like we haven't even mentioned yet, Trey Green, and in terms of helping him out, Bauer Sharp, and helping the tight ends help out, two new tackles that are going to be playing for LSU this year in terms of getting the start. So it's an exciting time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Trey hasn't even been with the basketball team now for about 3 weeks. So like he theoretically should be in that weight room with football, putting on the necessary pounds and getting his body into more football shape here for spring practice. Like I'd be shocked if we walked out there next Wednesday on the 12th and that Trey wasn't out there, not participating. So I think he's one of the bigger X factors on this team, maybe one of the bigger X factors in the SEC. Like if he starts to hit his ceiling as a player,
I don't know how you stop LSU's offensive passing attack.
Yeah. I mean,
I
6'7" tight end, 6'4" Nick Anderson. You got Aaron Anderson, who was really good for LSU last year in the red zone and in clutch time situations. You have a guy in Barry and Brown who's really speedy. You got Chris Hilton, who's a speedster down the field as well. Xavier Thomas is a gadget player. You've got Caden Durham. Hopefully Caleb Jackson can start to come into his own in year 3. Harlan Berry, JT Lindsay, like you mentioned, are very talented true freshmen. Like there's no shortage of weapons, but if you're able to get the most out of Trey Green in his sophomore season, I think you're looking at a double-digit touchdown guy easy, and I think you're looking at a guy who is one of the better pass catchers in the entire conference.
I'm with you. No, I'm with you. I think it has the potential to be a really, really fun season for the offense. And obviously, you want to see growth on the defensive side of the football there as well. But hey, we're going to have great coverage starting obviously next week with spring football. We'll obviously you parlay that with recruiting as spring visits start to take place as well. And so it's a great time to head over to Go 24/7. You can check out that full article that Glenn was talking about where he talks about each question he has at each position group heading into spring football, baseball content rolling along as well. And Glenn, we don't have to talk about the other sport, and we don't. It is what it is.
Hopefully, help is on the way. That's all.
That's a good way of looking at it. That's a good way of looking at it. No, we appreciate you tuning in. We appreciate you watching. Make sure you subscribe over on the YouTube channel. You like this video, you comment your thoughts down below, and head over to the Go 24/7 message boards and join a great community as well as we talk all things LSU all year round. He is Glen West. My name is Bryce Koon, and we will catch you next time here on the Go 24/7 podcast.